Hey everyone, it's Brian Cantrell. I'm the CTO of Oxide Computer Company. It's great to be back at P99, one of my favorite conferences, a real model for the new online conferences. So today I'm going to actually be doing something that I don't know that I've ever had the opportunity to do, which is to revisit a talk that I gave a decade plus ago. I'm getting old here. Although I would like to say that I was carded when buying alcohol last night, which really made me feel great because I'm turning 50 this year. So that, but I'm old. And a decade ago, this is me a decade ago. And I'm at this conference, FISLE in Brazil, which was for a time really one of the preeminent international open source conferences. And I was presenting on corporate open source anti-patterns, and in particular, some of the things that I had seen over my career at the time, so spanning from the 90s into the 2000s and the early 2010s, and talking about some of the things that I had seen that felt like preventable mistakes. Things that I saw corporations doing over and over and over again, and tried to explain what I was seeing in hopes that other companies would avoid some of the same mistakes. And I think whether my presentation had any role, I don't know that I would say that, but we did see things really change a lot from when I gave this in 2012. There have been a lot of changes since then. But before I talk about this, you may be looking at this because whenever I see a talk of me from late 2012, especially, but in kind of the years leading up to 2012, you may be noticing like, what the hell is that thing on his arm? And look, this is embarrassing, and I'm sorry, I'm an oversharer, but I can't walk past this without doing this. If you're wondering this, that's a reasonable thing to wonder. I realize that many people were wondering it when it showed up in the YouTube comments. I can't remember if it was on this video that I gave at FISLE or one that I gave in kind of the fall of 2012, but someone in the YouTube comments was like, this talk is interesting, but I can't stop staring at that lump on his arm. Does he know about it? Should he see a doctor about it? So I would like to assure everyone that I know about it. It's what's called a lipoma. I had it removed. Again, I should probably give you a content warning. That's the lipoma there. Which the docs, I think, were not as surprised as you might think that I wanted to take a picture of it. They were surprised that I wanted to take it home. You can't do that, apparently. But I wanted to let everybody know that it's a lipoma. It's been removed. My kids give me grief about it, but that's all gone. So I know that you answering a question you definitely didn't ask. With my apologies for being an oversharer. But so that FISLE talk was really fun to give. And it's fun to now look back on that and reflect again on how the corporate open source anti-patterns have shifted and how open source have shifted, because there's a lot of actually new mistakes to talk about. That's the good news. We got lots and lots of content. And the kind of question is, because in that talk, I vowed at the end of that talk to come back in a decade. And I said, come back to my FISLE 2022 talk, because in particular, I didn't want to imply that I knew the answers. I definitely didn't know the answers then, and I don't know the answers now. And in talking about anti-patterns and talking about things not to do, these are the things that I feel a bit more certain about. I feel a bit more certainty describing how not to do it rather than how to do it, which I know is frustrating, but that's part of the reason I asked people to come back in a decade so we could reflect on the new mistakes that I or we might be making. And again, the good news is there are tons of those. The bad news is not really clear what the venue is. FISLE hasn't been held since 2018. OSCON, which was the preeminent open source conference, OSCON has also disappeared. And I think that this has happened for a couple of reasons. One, the nature of conferences has changed. Witness P99 and being an online conference, which I love. It's really accessible and lots of people can join and can participate, which is terrific. So the nature of the conferences has changed, but also the nature of open source has changed. And we don't exactly have conferences on things that are entirely mainstream. And open source went really entirely mainstream. And I actually think it is totally fitting that this update a decade later is happening at the online conference of a company that is built around open source, Solidity. So to me, this is very, very fitting that it's happening here. I'm really honored to be here this morning presenting my thoughts on how things have shifted. But before we do that, I do want to talk about the singular importance of open source. And I know that we all know how important open source is, but it really is worth stopping for a moment and reflecting on just how deeply profound it is. When we look at the history of human innovation, the innovations that have the greatest leverage, the innovations that unlock the most in our shared human potential, are those innovations that themselves enable further innovation. And this is very much Moore's law for semiconductors. Especially through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, the increase in transistor density and speed and the drop in cost and the increase in power efficiency, all of those things together allowed other people to solve different problems. It unlocked innovation. One of my favorite Steve Jobs quotes from way back in the day when he describes the power of the computer is that it is a bicycle of the mind. The bicycle being a simple but very innovative device that allows humans to travel remarkably efficiently, more efficient than effectively anyone else in the animal kingdom. And the computer is a bicycle of the mind. It's really profound. And software, it is magical yet again, beyond the computer. Software is, and it's trite to say, but it truly does stand alone in terms of human achievement, in that it is at once information and machine. And it acts like both, or either at different times. The fact that you can take this thing and you can download it and then run it is marvelous and unique to software. And when we take this kind of magical property of software and we combine it with the internet, very important revolution, we combine that with distributed version control, also an extremely important innovation, and one that I think that we don't tell the story of enough. And the history of Git, and before that BitKeeper, and before that Teamware at Sun, and this idea of the bring over, modify, merge model that allows us to collaborate across a network, allows us to collaborate easily on a project, to not have a single person locking a file in a shared project, which used to be the way it worked, believe it or not, before distributed version control. So when you combine the internet and distributed version control, and you add to that open source, you add to that people making their source code available, because the economics don't require them to spend anything to do so. When I put my software up on GitHub, there's not a manufacturing line that I need to run to give that to you. You can simply download that and you can incorporate it into your project. So when you take the distributed version control of the internet, you add open source to it, and you get this unbelievable engine of software innovation. And I say that as a reminder, because I know as practitioners, it feels like everything is kind of boogered up and broken all the time, and that everything is kind of unbridled complexity and it's all terrible. But it's worth pausing for a moment and just reflecting on the fact that it's not actually all terrible. It's actually extraordinary and magical, and that we've been able to collaborate across distance. We collaborate with people in other countries, people we've never met, across time, being able to actually collaborate, being able to pull an open source project that maybe hasn't needed to have work done on it in years, and being able to do work on it or use that open source project as part of another project. It's just, it's extraordinary. And you have to put open source, or this combination of open source and the internet and distributed version control, it has to be considered one of humanity's crowning achievements. And honestly, we have all together won the generational lottery in that we are alive in this unbelievable singular time with respect to this engine of innovation in open source software. And I believe hand on heart that open source is software's equivalent of Moore's Law. We all talk about how great Moore's Law was, and what is the software equivalent of it? The software equivalent is open source. And just as a thought experiment, go back and build the software you're building today, and don't use any open source components from the last decade. Restrict yourselves to those things that stopped development a decade ago. And you will find that it's like really hard to build stuff because you don't have a modern database. You don't have a modern language. There's a lot of things you don't have. You don't have modernity. And the modernity that you have in that language, in that database, in that framework, those are almost universally open source. Everything that you use that's technical today, whether it's the phone in your pocket, whether it's your laptop, whether it's your car, whether it's the flight that you take, whether it's your kids at school, every element has an open source component at its heart. An open source component has helped make that possible. That's amazing, and we shouldn't lose track of that. That open source is really, really extraordinary. So I want to make sure we kind of couch this correctly when we talk about anti-patterns. Now, by anti-patterns, I mean things that you shouldn't do, and they become anti-patterns in part because they get copied. Like a pattern. People see someone doing the wrong thing, and they themselves do the wrong thing, not realizing it's like, no, that's the wrong thing. Anti-patterns have very much shifted over the last decade. And the good news, actually, is that the anti-patterns that I talked about a decade ago were really focused on companies that were established, that were trying to understand how to engage with open source. And you know, if there was kind of a villain of that talk a decade ago, it was Oracle. Oracle is an embodiment of misbehavior with respect to open source. And I talked about a bunch of things that Oracle did that shouldn't be things that people should emulate. But the good news is we really have things have shifted, and the behavior by established companies has really, really improved. A decade ago, we didn't see a lot of open source contributions from the likes of the big public cloud companies. We didn't see necessarily open source contributions from the likes of the big social networks. That all changed, and we have seen big, profound contributions from Amazon, from AWS, from Meta, from Google, certainly, from Microsoft. I mean, it's amazing to think that if you were alive in the 90s and listening to the rhetoric that a Steve Ballmer era Microsoft had around open source, which was so corrosive and so backwards looking and so destructive. And then you look at Microsoft's behavior today, where they have open sourced really deeply innovative stuff, not least TypeScript, right? TypeScript starting at Microsoft, really important innovation in terms of the way we deal with the front end. But it doesn't end there, right? Microsoft has done really important stuff. Never thought that I would live to see the day, honestly. And it's great. So that's all terrific. Existing companies are doing a great job. The anti-patterns that we have seen in the last decade are more nuanced, and they are around those companies that have built themselves around open source, that have an open source project, and they build a company around that. And that's understandable because these companies, which include, by the way, are terrific hosts in terms of Scylla. Scylla is an open source company. They built a product around an open source offering. And that's tricky. It's great in a lot of ways. It's important in so many different ways. And we should be encouraging these kinds of companies. But it also has to be said that these companies have a very complicated relationship with open source because it's so intertwined with their business. So these new anti-patterns are anti-patterns that we have seen from companies, fortunately not our hosts, which I think Scylla is a model for how to build an open source company in so many different ways. But we've seen other companies that are an anti-model about ways to screw it up. And we've seen a bunch of these at this point, and there are lots of ways to screw it up. So what are some of these anti-patterns? But before I get to that, and before we kind of talk specifically about some of these anti-patterns, I want to talk about kind of the fabric underneath them, which is the social contract. And I talked about this a decade ago, but open source is not merely the artifact that you download and run, and it's not merely the developers, it's not merely the community. It is the social contract between all these. What do we mean by a social contract? A social contract means it's not a legal contract. You don't litigate, but it is a social contract. It is about being a good human being, and not good in kind of the necessarily the charitable or altruistic sense, but being decent and respectful and understanding that you're going to give a little that maybe you're not contractually obligated to give, and you're going to get a little that maybe that person or another entity was not contractually obligated to give you. It is a social contract. And the fact that we have open source at the bedrock of our information infrastructure, and at the core of that bedrock is a social contract, is extraordinary. And if you were to go back in time to the 1990s and describe the world that we live in today, no one would believe you, at least not with Microsoft, right? The fact that enlightened self-interest has brought us this far is really amazing. So the anti-patterns that we see really arise because companies forget this. They forget this social contract. They forget the social contract that has really, that they owe a lot to, honestly, and they want to kind of rip up their half of it. And that's a real problem. So the number one anti-pattern, or the first one that I saw, was conflating users with customers. Users of an open source project are not customers. Almost tautologically, right? And the road to ruin for an open source project that is contemplating becoming a business is to look at that popularity, the downloads, the GitHub stars, what have you, and conflate that with product market fit. Now, it's not to say that popularity is great and is important and is signal. It's telling you that this is valuable to the world. But it may or may not be telling you that there is an actual product to be built here. And the real part of the challenge here is that what appears to potentially be product market fit is going to be catnip to investors. So investors love high margin, high growth companies. And there was especially an era in the mid 20 teens. What do we call those, I guess? The mid teens? I'm not sure we call that. But there was an era in the mid teens when there was a lot of venture investment in these projects that had explosive popularity. And it wasn't really clear what the path was to monetization. And I remember having a discussion with a venture capitalist. They had just invested in a company that was very popular at the time, Docker Inc. And I didn't really personally see a path to monetization. And the venture capitalist pointed like, no, I've no doubt that this is going to be monetizable. Just look at the downloads. The downloads keep going up. And what I pointed out to them is like, yeah, but what if what you're actually seeing is anti-signal? What if the popularity of that project is because a developer is saying, no, I like this because it can't be monetized. I am building complicated software infrastructure, and I need to know that I don't have a proprietary product at its foundation. I need to know that I don't need to pay a tax for what I'm building, that there's not going to be a toll booth that I am inadvertently constructing. So I am actually downloading this because I know it can't be monetized, and you as a venture capitalist may be selecting those things that are actually not monetizable. Admittedly, the venture capitalist got a bit of a pale look and said, do you think that's true? I'm like, I don't know. I think it could be true. I think that it is dangerous to conflate downloads with customers. They're not the same thing. Again, you should look at that popularity seriously. That popularity is great, but don't assume that that's going to be monetizable into a business. And on that kind of theme, another anti-pattern that we see from software entrepreneurs a lot is the conflation of gross margin with net margin. And so I founded, along with my co-founder Steve Tuck, founded a computer company. So we get to hear this a lot from investors who think like, wow, I love the gross margin of software. I love the gross margin of software too, but you need to look at net margin. Net margin is actually not just the cost of goods sold, which is damn near free for software, but you got to also subtract all of the other costs in running a business. And investors should look at net margin, but they broadly don't. They look at gross margin. And net margin is about how efficiently you run the rest of your business. And part of the problem that has gotten us into this kind of collective pickle is that investors enthusiastically throw their money after this high gross margin business. And they effectively, because they do invest a lot of money, they really capitalize the company. The company's got a high valuation that they need to live up to. They now effectively force a 1990s era proprietary software company playbook upon that open source company. That is unsustainable. And it is very tempting to just blame the VCs, but it definitely takes two to tango here. And the entrepreneurs are every bit as much to blame about this. And I've seen this happen. There are many of these companies, by the way, are already defunct. Companies that took too much money without thinking about how am I going to build a sustainable business. If you are sitting on a popular open source project, don't do this, or be very, very careful. When you take money, when you take capitalization, know how you're going to build a product. This leads us to an anti-pattern that we've seen a lot of, which is relicensing. A decade ago, I called out copyright assignment as an anti-pattern. I still believe this is an anti-pattern, by the way, generally. And I think that new projects shouldn't have copyright assignment. But I also think that it's not wholly unreasonable. Many projects do have copyright assignment, and I get it. What I would say to those companies that demand copyright assignment for participation in their community, I get it. You now have to understand that you are entering into a more explicit social contract. Namely, the person that has contributed that to you under that license is really on the understanding that they are doing that in part because that software is going to be made available to other people under an open source license. You have a moral responsibility to those contributors. And I get the need to sublicense and licensing to a third party. I get all that. I think everyone understands that this is going to be sublicensed in some ways. That's fine. But to relicense the work that has been assigned to you to a less permissive license, which is to say a non-open source license, I think it's wrong. And I think that needs to weigh on folks that are considering relicensing. And now this is where we get into a conversation with my teenagers, because I'm going to tell you don't do this, but then if you do, so if you do find yourself at a party where this is happening, if you find yourself at a party where Dad, everybody was relicensing. Okay, so everybody's relicensing. There is a spectrum here. And in particular, there is relicensing that is really not just open source, but anti-competitive. And these folks are concerned about the public cloud companies competing with them. And to prevent the public cloud companies from competing with them, they're putting strictures on their license that restrict their use effectively as a service, to say that you as a public cloud company may not use my software as part of a service. These licenses are not open source. Don't even think of them as open source. And this has been to kind of force us to kind of wash down this bitter pill. They're choked down the bitter pill. We have something called the business source license, the BUSL, which is parameterized with an open source license, which it will revert to over time, which I guess is better than nothing, but not much. To say that this becomes MPLv2 after 4 years or what have you, that's not much of a salve on this. These are not open source licenses. Even worse, again, conversation with the teenagers. Okay, you're at the party where everyone was relicensing. You're at the party now where there's a lot of anti-competitive relicensing. Even worse is to make non-specific anti-competitive licensing. And in these very worst implementations of the BUSL, the language is entirely vague. And so this is actually a quote, sadly, from HashiCorp's relicensing with the my replaced with HashiCorp. But you may make production use license work, provided such use does not include offering the license work to third parties on a host or embedded business, which is competitive with my products. That is terrible. I cannot believe that any lawyer signed off on this, because it's terrible, because it's vague. What does any of this mean? What do products mean? What does competitive mean? What does even hosted or embedded mean? And you have all these kind of like follow-up questions. In particular, the on products. What about the products of an acquirer? Do I have to do the math of any company that might acquire you, and if I'm competitive with their products? Because obviously I can't use this thing. I can't know why I can use it and why I can't. And which leads to another anti-pattern of extra licensing, where there are so many questions that come from this. What is a product? What is competitive? And so on, that they actually, all this spills into the FAQ. They've got frequently asked questions. A FAQ is not a license. You cannot, no one, no lawyer certainly, no one who is risk averse is going to look to a FAQ as any kind of assurance about what's in the license. So, and I think this is especially happening because this early licensing happens with total disregard for the community. The community has a bunch of questions and they try to answer them in the FAQ. If you want it in the license, put it in the license. And again, just please don't do this. Another anti-pattern, if you are ever referring to a community as freeloaders, if you're using the term freeloaders, let's not use the term freeloaders, please. Everything that we are building necessitates open source. We are all freeloaders here. Everybody is standing on the work of other folks. We are all collaborating together. Please don't use the term freeloaders. What is even more galling is that some of these companies, and again, I hate to call them out, but I really felt we saw this in the HashiCorp case, which is very disappointing, where they don't even seem to be focused on the service providers. They are focused on the participants in their own community, and they are worried about competing with elements of their own community. And if you feel as a company that your community consists of freeloaders, that you are losing competitively to your own community, in the words of fictional venture capitalist Lori Bream from HBO's superlative Silicon Valley, look inward. That is a problem that you have at your company. It is not a problem with your community. In HashiCorp's case, they were not really accepting a lot of contributions from the community, and the community bridled when the license changed. You cannot demand trust after violating it. You can't rip up one end of the social contract. You can't say that I am not going to uphold my end of this, but I expect you to uphold your end of this. And we are all in many different open source communities. And when trust is destroyed in those communities, don't think for a second that the community doesn't have a choice. They do. The community can pick up and do their own thing. If you violate trust completely, and by the way, trust can be violated very quickly, but if you do it completely or wantonly, you do it with reckless disregard for your own community, you call your strategy malicious, which sadly they did, the community itself will pick up and they will leave. And you will be left without the thing that made your software compelling. Don't do this. There's not a reason for any of this. And we've seen this now with OpenTofu. And the whole thing is tragic. OpenTofu is great, and I think it's going to be great, but it was all unnecessary. In terms of like learning from these anti-patterns, these are not hard and fast rules. I said this a decade ago. I think this is still true. Local conditions are going to vary. And if one of these things doesn't make sense to you, for example, it may make sense. I mean, I'm opposed to relicensing, but maybe like, hey, you know what? I actually checked in with my community and I talked to my community, and this is a change that I'm socializing because they understand that I need to build a sustainable business, and this is the way that I need to do it. Sure, okay. And maybe then you were able to do, at Oxide, we use CockroachDB, and I really admire their implementation of the BUSL, which is very explicit about, it's not vague at all about who be violating their license, and we know that we're not. So I think that there are ways to do this in the right way, but it is really hard. And if you want to go build a company around open source, you need to start by asking a really important question. It seems very basic, but what do customers want to pay for? Ask that question. And what you'll discover is, if you've got a popular project, good news. Customers want to pay for lots of things. Customers are not freeloaders. People understand that I need to pay if I want certain things. And by the way, support and services are not dirty words. You can build a terrific business around support and service and having a polished product that is also open source. It is possible. I would say, remember that your business and the challenges of your business are not the community's problem. Don't make it the community's problem. Find a way to build a thriving, sustainable, healthy business and a thriving, healthy community. It is possible, but it's hard and it requires great attention to detail. And I would say, I said 10 years ago, come back in 2022, now 2023, and I would talk about the new mistakes. So I guess to keep with that theme, come back in 2033 feels like a very long time from now. If I'm still alive and ticking, I will, I guess, I don't know, it'll be AGI that's ruling the world. So we'll come back and try to prevent humanity from being licensed or something like that. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody.